So, good morning. My name is Sam Richard. I'm an engineering lead at IBM. And I want to talk to you today about leading the change that you want to see at work. So, to do this, we're going to start with our story. This story starts back in the fall of 2014. Now, back in the fall of 2014, we had a little bit of a crisis and a little bit of urgency in IBM, specifically within the front-end development community. There was a general sense of uneasiness amongst the front-end developers in the design org at IBM, which is based out of Austin. One of our front-end developers decided to conduct a little bit of research to figure out kind of exactly what was going on, exactly the problem that we had. And after that research, he came up with some really interesting findings. He found that neither the design organizations within IBM nor the engineering organizations within IBM really understood front-end development as a unique skill set that really kind of encompassed both design and engineering. It wasn't one or the other. It was a little bit of both. He found that on design teams, many front-end developers wound up not doing much front-end development at all. Depending upon who they worked for and what org they were in, a lot of them did user experience design or research instead of front-end development because their managers didn't really know how to manage front-end development. When they actually got a chance to develop, a lot of them found that the engineering orgs and engineers really didn't view them as real developers. Instead, thinking of them as designers who never really worked in enterprise before and didn't really know all of the ins and outs of actually developing. They didn't use the same stack. They used different methods, different tools, different techniques. So the engineers kind of viewed them as inferior. On the flip side, front-end developers who came in through the design org often viewed front-end developers in the engineering orgs as out of date and out of touch with modern tools, techniques, and best practices. This was an inflection point at IBM where we were moving from mandated technology stacks to kind of more choose-your-own technology stacks. So a lot of the engineers in IBM really knew the Java and Dojo stack and not much else, whereas a lot of the engineers coming in through the design org came from open source, came from GitHub and modern JavaScript tooling and techniques. Needless to say, all of this wound up creating a lot of tension and frustration, and a lot of our front-end developers considered leaving IBM. And when I say considered leaving, I mean a lot of the ones that were hired in for design were almost openly talking about only staying until they didn't have to pay back their signing bonus anymore and then leaving. And that's not good. Enter our innovators and our community. So innovation within this problem space started with local practitioners in the Austin community who could leverage the local channels they had to become leaders in this space before there was ever an official way to actually have leadership here. So we had one developer, a woman named Una Kravitz, who was a front-end developer with a background in community organizing. And what she did was she started an IBM Austin local kind of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing event called FedDate. She started that back in the fall of 2014, and it still goes on every Monday. So it was a peer-to-peer, no-cost way of kind of starting to build a community. A developer named Kevin Suttle and myself, we were considered thought leaders in front-end development within our respective business units, and we wound up creating a virtual community through Slack. Now, IBM at the time didn't use Slack, so this was kind of a new experiment that we were bringing into the company to see if we could build this community, knowing that our front-end developers are a little bit fragmented and known some of the pains that our front-end developers had. A visual designer who does a lot of code, a woman named Jessica Tremblay, she helps lead the Austin chapter of the AIGA Professional Design Organization, and she put together a twice-a-month lunch and learn called Feducation, whose goal was kind of a broader front-end development learning section, or learning session, whereas Fed dates kind of are more localized to the site that they're on. All of these innovators and the actions that they took to try and stem some of this uneasiness within our community led in 2015, in January of 2015, for the GM of design, a guy named Phil Gilbert, to empower Feducation as an official design program. And he wound up creating a program called Fed at IBM. In April of 2015, a guy named Damon Diener, who is a proven leader within IBM already, was brought in by Phil as a member of the IBM design leadership, specifically to guide the global front-end development community, specifically to lead Fed at IBM. This was something that no other discipline really had, no other community really had. This was kind of a big deal. What it wound up doing is it wound up giving these individual innovators within IBM some real legitimacy to their problems and to their solutions, and helped these grassroots organizations grow. So we had these different individual innovators and different individual programs that were being run, but to really spread it throughout IBM, we needed a shared vision. We needed something that we could go and talk with other IBMers about outside of our little close-knit bubbles. So as was previously researched, the Fed at IBM community, and specifically kind of this group of leaders within it, identified a number of problems with the way that work was getting done kind of around IBM and on their teams. And those who had risen to those leadership positions by actually trying to solve them worked with Damon and took a look at what changes could be made. And what's interesting is, from very early on, we all kind of had a shared vision of what the front-end development discipline at IBM could be. We wanted to work with modern tools, we wanted to work with modern techniques, we wanted to work with best practices from the wider community and kind of look outward towards how we should be doing front-end development as opposed to only looking inward. But to get there, we needed our business units to acknowledge that front-end development was a unique skill set and that it was a career path with specializations, something that they had already acknowledged with design and back-end development skills. All of our values that we came up with, all of this kind of guiding vision that we had, were all crafted by similar principles, and especially around kind of social coding and open source. And that allowed us, we all kind of had a similar background, so that allowed us to really move quickly in understanding what we wanted the future state to be. With this kind of vision, with this group of people who could lead some activities with this vision, we were able to take some action. The programs and communication channels that our leaders put together, like Feducation and the Slack channel, allowed us to diffuse, to spread our vision across our community and grow it much more rapidly than if we tried to go and have one-on-one conversations with everyone. So FedDate, which was the program started by Yuna, allowed our feds, regardless of where they came from, to share new, cool, and relevant kind of technology or projects for their local community. Feducation wound up providing this twice-a-month recorded education to our global community that we have, to this day, people from all over the world dialing in every other, I think it's Wednesday, to listen and to empower themselves. We've included leaders from inside our community in Feducation, and we've included leaders from outside of our community, like Alex Russell and Sarah Drasner. GitHub's come and talked, ZenHub's come and talked. The Mozilla Developer Roadshow, when they came through Austin, they came through IBM, and we hosted Mozilla for their Developer Roadshow. And then we created this new program called Hackademy. It's actually a program that I run, and it's a week-long traveling training and enablement program whose goal is to bring that shared vision that we have to those who need it most, to the people who otherwise wouldn't get this training, who otherwise would be blocked and wouldn't be able to work in these new ways, new tools, new techniques, wouldn't get exposure to it, to bring it to them and give them direct interaction with a lot of our community's thought leaders. All of our programs wind up empowering our community members with new knowledge and connections with other members from the larger IBM community. It breaks them out of their sometimes close-knit business unit bubble. FedDate and Feducation have shown a lot of quick wins for our organization. We've shown that we can teach and we can empower our front-end developers from a grassroots organization, a grassroots perspective, and that knowledge actually gets brought back to their business units. Hackademy gets our community actually working in these new ways. Part of this training program is actually having them go build something with these new tools and techniques. So they feel what it's like to work in these new ways. They feel what it's like to be able to do continuous delivery on a modern tool chain using modern code. And that's really empowering for these individuals because that is something that we've seen them take back specifically to their business units. Almost more importantly than that, some of the projects that have come out of Hackademy have helped IBM win client work directly, and some of them have become kind of staples in the larger IBM community. So we've been able to show to our developers not only can they produce really good work quickly with these modern tools and techniques, but we've been able to show the business that working this way can actually be really beneficial. And all of this we wind up anchoring within the cultural transformation that's happening at IBM right now. So the values of the front-end development community are really closely aligned with a lot of larger initiatives that are happening within IBM right now. Things like a push for social coding within the company, a push for continuous delivery inside the company, not just continuous engineering delivery, but continuous delivery for all of our areas of work, and a push for agile. Our practices wind up aligning really well with some of the tools that IBM are adopting, like GitHub Enterprise and Slack and Travis and ZenHub, tools that are really meant to pair engineering and agile and continuous delivery, pair those values together with actually getting work done. And this close connection between the new tools and techniques and values that are being spread throughout IBM's culture allow us to set up our community to be innovators and early adopters within their business units. If they're already familiar with how all this works through our community, then when their local communities want to start to adopt these tools, or as they start to adopt them, then they wind up being the innovators that their business unit can turn to, which gives them a lot of power. So that's the end of our story. Someone pretty high up in our organization has this to say. So this story comes from a reflection that I did on our front-end development transformation about a year ago at this point. Our transformation's not done yet, but at the time that I posted this was one of our comments from someone very senior in our company. And it's not only the front-end development community at IBM that has benefited from this work that the front-end development, or the Fed at IBM program has done. Our engineering group as a whole at IBM has prospered because of it. So starting from a realization there was a problem within our community, we had grassroots leaders start a program that now is globally recognized within our community as having a positive impact on the culture of IBM and more than just the design group that they had initially started with, the engineering group and kind of all of IBM as a whole. And that's really powerful. It didn't require us to have leadership positions already. And we were able to get this kind of result and are still working on that. So, how do we get there? Or, more importantly, how do we get change to scale? Because that's really what we're talking about. And really what the secret to our work is we kind of accidentally did this, but if I had known when we started this how to actually get change to scale, we probably wouldn't have changed much, but it would have been a much smoother ride for us to get there. So there are kind of three different concepts that describe how transformation evolves. And those we'll go over all three of them right now. The first one is this idea of paradigm shifts, first introduced by Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The next one is the diffusion of innovations, which is research done by a guy named Everett Rogers, who released a book of the same name. And the final is organizational change, which we'll talk about through the lens of John Kotter's Leading Change. So the first concept is this idea of paradigm shifts. So like I said, first described by Thomas Kuhn in his landmark publication, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. A paradigm can roughly be described as the agreed upon way of doing work amongst a group. Within this, there's something called normal work. Normal work is work being done within an existing paradigm. How you work today is your existing paradigm. That's your normal work. Once a paradigm starts to reach its limits, anomalies or failures in the current paradigm, or failures that the current paradigm can't really take into account based on what everyone is seeing, they start to accumulate, which we see kind of at the end here. When individuals inside of a community judge that the anomalies are significant enough that the paradigm is starting to lose hold, they kind of decide for themselves that a crisis has occurred. And those individuals embark on what Kuhn describes as revolutionary science, but we can more generally think of as revolutionary thinking, as a way to explore alternatives. And that's really important. Individuals generally don't go out and try and find new ways of working unless the current way of working doesn't work for them. You're not going to be able to convince anyone to change the way that they work if they don't feel like anything's wrong, if they don't feel there's a crisis, if they don't feel like there actually needs to be a change in thinking in order to get that, in order to resolve those problems. This revolutionary thinking can lead to what's called a candidate paradigm. Now, a candidate paradigm has anomalies when it begins as well, because it's new, it's immature, it's still evolving. And there's going to be some hesitancy to adopt it, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, it's normal. You wouldn't want people just kind of dropping how they work at the drop of a hat. But over the course of time, if that new paradigm winds up proving to be a more useful way of working, then slowly people will start to adopt that. And as people are starting to adopt that, as individuals are going from their normal work to working on this new paradigm, that's what's called a paradigm shift. That's when you move from your old way of working, your normal work, to the candidate paradigm. Once that candidate paradigm is now the new way of working, that is your paradigm shift. So to bring it back to the story we just talked about, the Fed at IBM story started with our initial leaders seeing that the paradigm at IBM, how we worked, couldn't sustain how front-end development was being done for this new group of people being brought in. These leaders and these community members being brought into design, they saw a lot of anomalies within how IBM used to work. And there were individuals who determined that that was a large enough crisis that they embarked on this revolutionary thinking to come up with a new way of working, a new vision for working, for IBM to move forward and for front-end developers to kind of be able to stretch their legs as their craft and as their discipline. Right now, we haven't completed our paradigm shift at IBM. We're still currently in the midst of it. There's a great quote, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." That's kind of where we are right now within that paradigm shift. There are some business units that have fully embraced this, and there are other business units that haven't yet, and that's okay. Paradigms tend not to take hold immediately. There's going to be this transition period while individuals kind of determine whether or not they think that they should be taking on this new way of working. And really, to kind of understand that, what we need to understand is how innovations get adopted, or the diffusion of innovations, how innovations spread. So, as theorized by Everett Rogers, how revolutionary thinking spreads, or diffuses, is a matter of really 5 items. The innovation itself, its adopters, the communication channels it moves over, the systems, the social systems, I should say, it moves through, and of course, time. So, with those 5 items, the innovation that he's talking about is that revolutionary thinking. It's that new paradigm, that candidate paradigm. It may be an idea, it may be a practice, it may be an object. For our concept, or for our discussion, it's the actual revolutionary thinking. The adopters are, as he's described, the minimal unit of analysis, usually an individual or an organization that wants to actually adopt something. So for our type of work, it's individuals that need to adopt. For change management, it's individuals that need to adapt and adopt our innovation. It eventually will need to be our organization, but to begin with, it needs to be individuals. The communication channels that innovations move through, those are important because that's what allows for actual information to move from one adopter to another. If you don't have strong communication channels, you're not going to be able to get adopters to talk with each other and actually spread your innovation. The social systems are the external and the internal influences that those adopters that you want to influence are subject to. So within IBM, we had kind of really 2 big sets of social systems. We had internal social systems, so the history of IBM and how it's done software development in the past. That was a social system. The actual social constructs inside of each business unit, which for all intents and purposes run like their own companies. And then there were external influences. A lot of us were coming from open source. Some of us were coming from like the conference circuit. So we had a lot of external influences influencing the way that we thought and the way that we wanted to work because we were well connected with the outside world. And then finally, time. Time is needed for any diffusion. Things rarely get adopted instantaneously. So once we kind of understand those 5 points, then what diffusion science describes is the 5 different types of adopters. And each of them have different needs and different rates of adoption. So what we have on screen here, this is the diffusion of innovation curve. It's based on research that Everett did. It comes from his book. And it describes, or it shows you the bell curve of adoption. So at the very leading edge of this bell curve of adoption, you have something called innovators. Innovators are willing to take risk. They tend to have high social status within whatever their social construct is. They can absorb the cost of taking risk really well, and they're willing to adapt and adopt innovations that may wind up failing. Socially, they have very close contacts with other innovators and with the people who are doing the actual revolutionary thinking. And in fact, they might actually be those people themselves. Your innovators make up about 2.5% of your potential adopters. And they're going to be the ones that adopt your innovation first. They are going to be the ones that kind of dive in. So they're really, really important. It's going to be very hard to get the rest of the types of adopters if you don't have innovators on your side. The next group, which is about 13.5% of total potential adopters, are your early adopters. Your early adopters tend to have the highest degree of thought leadership amongst the categories that your community cares about. These tend to be your thought leaders. They tend to have pretty high social status within their communities, and they tend to be socially forward. They tend to actually go out and talk with other people. They have they tend to be more discreet in their adoption of choices than innovators. They tend to think about whether or not something will succeed as opposed to just diving all in. And they wind up banking on their good judgment to help them maintain their position in their community as a central communication point. They really want to be viewed as like the filter through which decisions get made. So they won't adopt everything. They'll adopt things that they think are likely to succeed. And again, they make up about 13.5% of your potential adopters. The next group, your early majority, makes up 34% of approximately 34% of your total adopters. And they tend to adopt innovations after a varying degree of time. It tends to be a lot longer than innovators and early adopters, and they don't all adopt it at once. Early majority, they tend to have an average social status within their community and have some connections usually with early adopters, maybe not necessarily innovators, but they tend to have connections with early adopters. People in the early majority are rarely considered thought leaders within their group, but they're a really important part because right around the point where you start to gain early adopters is right around the point where you start to hit a critical mass of adoption. A group, critical mass being the point at which adoption can more or less sustain itself, where there's little or much less actual hands-on tending that you need to do to sustain adoption. So the early majority, once you start to get the early majority in, that's the group that's really important to seeing whether or not your innovation, whether or not your candidate paradigm is something that's likely to succeed. Between your innovators, your early adopters, and your early majority, those three groups make up 50% of your total potential adopters. Those are people who will jump on something new, are considered thought leaders, and are fast followers from thought leaders. The other 50%, they're a lot harder to get on board. So the next 34-ish% of your potential adopters are what are called late majority. The late majority, they really only adopt innovation after the average adopter, after kind of the whole early majority, your average person says, yeah, this is cool, I think I'm going to start using it. They tend to approach innovation with a high degree of skepticism and really only tend to have contacts with individuals in the early majority group or other people within their late majority group. They're not really usually thought of as thought leaders within their community. And then finally, you have laggards. And laggards is a little bit of a harsh name, but it's the name that Diffusion Science uses, so I'm going to use it as well. Laggards tend to be the last people to adopt an innovation, and sometimes they'll only adopt an innovation if they literally have no other choice. For instance, there are still people who use flip phones, and they still use flip phones because they, in the diffusion scale, some of them would tend to be laggards, where they just don't want to give up their flip phone for a smartphone. They don't see a real need for it. Laggards tend to have an aversion to change agents. They tend not to like people who are trying to change things. And they also tend to have a really big focus on tradition. Laggards, according to Diffusion Science, tend to have a pretty small social circle, really only consisting of people within their immediate connections. They tend not to have much connection to innovators, early adopters, or early majority. They tend to view those people as change agents and don't necessarily like them. Laggards are your last 16% of your potential adoption group. When talking about actually trying to get change initiatives to stick and who to focus on, oftentimes as engineers, we try and focus on all of the edge cases, and laggards certainly seem like an edge case, a group that doesn't want to change and aren't going to change and are focused on traditions. But diffusion science tells us not to focus on them. You need to get the other groups on board to build a critical mass. Once you have a critical mass in your innovation, then it doesn't really matter whether or not laggards want to adopt the change. They can choose to or not, as long as that innovation has become self-sustaining. So to consider this, again, in the context of that story I told, our first group of leaders within IBM, or within the Fed at IBM program, they were innovators that not only helped to codify the new paradigm we wanted to see, but helped to set up the communication channels and social structures for adopters to live in. We focused our initial set of innovations, I should say, on those early adopters we had close relationships with in Austin. We didn't try and focus on everyone to begin with. We focused on people we had connections to that we knew would want to adopt this. And then we expanded out to other early adopters who were looking to make changes in their global area. So we had this one really fabulous early adopter named Dawn in the UK, and she really, really wanted to set up Fed dates in her UK office, and she wanted to be part of Feducation. And Feducation at the time was a lunchtime Thursday thing, so that didn't work so well for the United Kingdom. So we wound up changing the time that Feducation happened so that we could accommodate a more global audience, so that we could bring in more early adopters to the community. Our Slack community and Hackademy wound up allowing us to reach more deeply into the community, reach into our potential adopters, reach our early majority, and really empower that early majority with and local early adopters who might not have the resources to actually do this on their own, learn and grow. So then the final piece that we're going to talk about is actually leading change. So leading change comes from John Kotter's, I always put an L in there, there's no L in John Kotter. John Kotter's Leading Change. It's widely considered one of the seminal works on strategy and change management. In it, Kotter describes what he views as the 8-step process for getting change to stick. So the first one is you need to establish a sense of urgency. After that, you need to create a guiding coalition. You then need to develop a vision and a strategy. You need to communicate that vision. You need to empower your employees or the individuals that you want to change for action. You need to generate short-term wins. You need to sustain those wins by using the small gains you get from there to power larger ones. And then finally, you need to anchor your new approaches in the culture of the organization you want to change. As John describes it, each one of these steps winds up being a prerequisite for the step before it, starting with a sense of urgency. As he discusses, urgency needs to come from a crisis, either one naturally occurring or one that's generated to spur change. The anomalies in the current working paradigm, that's what causes crisis. So having your current working paradigm not be able to stand in the face of the anomalies that you need to kind of work around to get it to work, that's what caused crisis. This is what that sense of urgency is. Now, as John says, you can create it by manufacturing crisis, manufacturing anomalies within your current working environment, or a much more powerful way to get that to work is by actually describing real anomalies that you see, actual business outcomes that are not being as successful is a really, really powerful one. That's the one that we wound up using. People being unhappy, retention rates, All of these are different examples of actual crises that you could use to help spur change and identify crisis. As Kuhn describes in Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that paradigm, these anomalies, the paradigm shift, it gives us a template for understanding crisis. Bless you. For understanding crisis and revolution, that paradigm shift, in more detail than John talks about in this book. The next thing that we need is a guiding coalition. That guiding coalition needs to be made up of individuals empowered by leadership or who have direct leadership power, or who have direct leadership power, to have a group to actually guide this change initiative. Now again, within this guiding coalition, you don't need to have everyone there be a leader already. You can have a grassroots organization like we did, but change initiatives basically get stopped in their tracks if it's a group of people who aren't empowered to actually do anything, trying to do stuff. You need to either have your leaders empower you to make the changes that you want to see, or you need to be closely connected and have those leaders who have that power in your change group to begin with. And it needs to be a true coalition of people who have a shared vision. It can't just be people who think, yeah, that's fine. When you have this guiding coalition, the next thing you need to do is you need to have a shared vision and strategy for actually affecting change. This is that paradigm shift bit. This is that revolutionary thinking. It's where we need to understand what the anomalies are, be able to coalesce those anomalies into a vision of change, and be able to present them as this guiding coalition for how we want change to happen and the strategy we want to take to actually have that change happen. Once we have that, once we understand that vision and understand that strategy, we need to actually disseminate those things amongst those who need to change. This is where diffusion science comes back in. Understanding who are the innovators and early adopters that you should target first, the people who are most likely to adopt new radical ways of working and are most comfortable taking risks and thought of as thought leaders within their organizations. Those are the people that you need to convince first. If you can't convince them, you're not going to convince anyone else. Getting them on board and getting them to buy into your vision helps, and getting them understanding their communication channels is what you need to actually get your vision spread. Once they get bought in, innovators and early adopters, that's how you get the early majority bought in, is by having innovators and early adopters buy into this vision and start working towards that goal. A vision only winds up being worthwhile if the individuals who have bought into that vision can take action on it. What you need to do is you need to be able to unblock people who are trying to take action. You need to empower people who are trying to take action on your vision. You can do this like what we did by providing programs and trainings and new systems and ways of working. You can do it by paving cow paths, going and talking with leaders directly, going and talking with managers. You can do this by really small things like having what we did with Slack, having a communication channel set up for people to just ask questions and then get answers to them without needing to kind of stew in their own concern. Being able, if individuals aren't able to actually take action on the vision's going to fail. You can have the greatest vision and greatest strategy for changing how the world works, but if people can't actually implement it, it's not going to work. This is the point where you really need to leverage innovators and early adopters. It's critical here. You need to unblock them as fast as you can so that they can see real value. Just because someone has agreed to your vision doesn't mean that they've decided it's useful for them. Being able to unblock innovators and early adopters to show them the use of this new paradigm will be critical to actually getting a wider adoption. Once we've kind of empowered our group, what we need to do is we need to generate short-term wins. We need to be able to show to the members, to the adopters who want to adopt this, and to our business, that what we're doing works, that what we're doing can actually solve the problem, solve those anomalies that exist in our current way of working that otherwise can't be solved. And when I say short-term wins, we're dealing with a multi-year change initiative. So a short-term win for a multi-year change initiative is 2 to 3 months. It's actually really kind of short. And if you're working on a shorter time frame, a short-term win could be something like a day or a week. You need to be able to prove to everyone, to adopters and to your business partners, that what you want to do is good, is going to solve those problems. The more short-term wins you can generate, the faster you can generate them, the easier it's going to be for people to make a decision as to whether or not they actually want to adopt this paradigm. But those short-term wins aren't necessarily enough to sustain the paradigm. In order to sustain your paradigm shift, in order to actually get that shift to happen, you need to take those short-term wins and you need to build on them. It's very tempting to look at a bunch of short-term wins in a row, say 6 months or a year's worth of wins, and say, cool, change initiative's done, we did it, it all works. And that usually doesn't lead to lasting change. You need to be able to build on the small wins that you get to get even larger wins, to create this sustainable momentum of working in this way being a more positive way to work than the previous working condition. You need to be able to show that this paradigm is sustainable and it's not just a little bit of change on top of the way that we already work. That's how you wind up going from early innovators and early adopters to kind of more of this critical mass, to being able to get early majority and be able to get some late majority individuals on board, is you need to be able to sustain the change and the wins that you have. And then finally, the way that you lock it in place, the way that you lock a change initiative in place, the way that you get the rest of the late majority and maybe even the laggards, is you need to tie your change to the organization's culture. If the culture of your organization stays the same while you're trying to work in new ways, it will wind up fighting against each other for which one is going to win out in the end. So things like changing HR policy, changing the ways that people are graded's the wrong word, changing the way that individuals' performance is looked at, changing the way that business performance is looked at, all are different ways, or changing the physical tools and techniques that the culture or that the organization uses, the social construct uses. That's imperative to actually getting change initiative to stick. If there's a new way of working but an old way of measuring, then the old way of measuring is going to win out over the new way of working because people work towards their measurements. Taking all this, when we look back at the Fed at IBM Journey, we didn't actually, like I said, know that we were doing all of this. When I was asked to go write up a blog post internally on this Fed at IBM transformation. And what I noticed was, looking back on that story, we wound up following all 8 steps that Kotter laid out kind of by accident. We had a sense of urgency. We formed a guiding coalition that had power to make change. We had a vision. we diffused that vision by creating communities and going out to our actual individuals. We empowered our individuals that way. We got lots of wins with our Feducation and Fed dates actually teaching people new things they brought back. We worked on sustaining that by bringing Hackademy. Hackademy went from an Austin local thing to a global traveling roadshow to actually bring this new education to other people to generate larger and larger wins. And we're anchoring our work within IBM's culture. The tools and techniques that we're using, they're all part of the new ways that IBM's looking to work. So, like I said before, we're actually setting our individuals up to be leaders in the new culture at IBM. We've really anchored our change there. So, to kind of wrap it all up, change is hard. Change is hard because people are hard. But that doesn't mean it can't be accomplished. We need to understand how change starts. We need to understand our current working paradigm. What isn't working? What are the anomalies that you see as a normal part of that paradigm? Do you see that the anomalies that you see, are they part of your normal working paradigm? Or are there enough of those anomalies, and are those anomalies serious enough for you that you think that there's a crisis? Remember, you don't need to already be a leader to initiate a change in your organization. If you see that there needs to be a paradigm shift to resolve these anomalies, you have to make that felt. You need to share the urgency you have. You need to share that crisis with other people. You need to build a guiding coalition to support that change. People who are empowered to make change, either from their leadership or who are leaders already. And you need to develop your vision of this new paradigm, and you need to communicate it. And then you finally need to diffuse your innovative paradigm to your organization. Getting change initiatives to stick and scale requires understanding of how innovations diffuse. You need to communicate and get innovators and early adopters on board with your vision, on board with this new paradigm as fast as possible. You need to make sure they're empowered to actually take action on this vision that you see, and you need to help unblock them. Your new paradigm, your new innovation, it needs to show wins really quickly to reinforce the movement of the innovators and early adopters, and to begin to build and gain the early majority. Building on those small wins for larger ones will allow you to grow your early majority base to the point where you reach critical mass, where you can actually start to have that change self-sustain. And then you need to anchor that change, anchor that new paradigm in the culture of the organization to make sure that you bring along the late majority and bring along the laggards, silence any laggards that exist, so that you have a fully self-sustaining changed culture. So with all this in mind, you should be able to create, sustain, and lead the change you want to see at work. Thank you. I think we have like 11 minutes. Am I lying?
We do.
Okay, so with 11 minutes, I can answer any questions you might have. That link for slides will be correct, and it will have the updated notes and everything once I actually commit them. Because I literally just finished my slides a minute after this talk was supposed to start. So, does anyone have any questions?
Great talk. This was amazingly good.
Thank you.
What I wanted to ask about was, before you guys did this change, you had already kind of had a reputation where people took you seriously when you said something. How would you build that reputation first?
So the question is, before we started this change initiative at work, we already had a reputation of being thought leaders. How do we build that thought leadership reputation? So, while it's true that myself and Kevin Suttle had a reputation for being thought leaders, The other individuals weren't necessarily considered thought leaders in front-end development. Una, at the time, wasn't the fabulous Una Kravitz that she is now. And Jessica Tremblay was kind of just a visual designer that really was interested in front-end development and community building. So they weren't thought of in quite the same like early adopter, innovator, thought leader space that Kevin and I were. But that didn't matter. They saw that there was a problem and they worked to change it. And by working to change it through smaller kind of mediums, FedDate really is it. FedDate literally, you can go do FedDate right now. Every Monday at 4 p.m., go find an open conference room and have someone talk about something. That's literally what FedDate is. So they found a problem and found a way to resolve it. And through that, gained thought leadership within the community by being those people who were the ones to actually go and innovate. That's how I've seen it. That's how I saw it done with individuals in this specific context. And I've seen that kind of throughout as we've started to scale this globally, where we've had a couple of individuals who might not be thought of as thought leaders in their group or in their context be really, really excited. They might be innovators or really want to be innovators. So they reached out to the larger group and they worked to get some of these programs brought to them. So in April, I was just in India, and we brought this Hackademy program to India. And I don't know the exact context of the individuals who brought us there, whether or not they were already considered thought leaders, but by bringing us there, they really did steward the front-end development community in India that wound up bringing us there. So you don't need to be that thought leader. You don't need to be that early adopter in order to be an innovator. You just kind of need to have an idea. And then you need to work to get other adopters and other innovators and early adopters to buy into that idea. But you don't need to be one to start.
Okay.
Cool.
You talked about people that will start also like joining the movement and things like that. Did you encounter people that actively worked against it?
So the question is, did we encounter people who actively worked against the change we wanted to make? Yes, and you will. I didn't include it in this presentation, but John Cotter in Leading Change specifically talks about them. I believe he uses the word negative change agents. And they are people who tend to be on the laggard side of the diffusion curve, who don't want to change. And they will actively fight against change. And it's hard. Like, dealing with that is hard. And sometimes he describes it's hard because there are a couple different ways people can be negative change agents. They can be actively against what you're working towards, which is kind of like a very easy thing to spot. But they can be passive as well. It can be a manager who buys into the idea and buys into that vision, but doesn't follow it themselves or doesn't enforce it below. And because they don't wind up following through, they wind up eroding trust in it. And it's hard. The way that we have found to work through that is honestly not pay them much mind. When thinking about this through the diffusion curve, you are not going to convince the laggards that they need to adopt something before the late majority or the early majority. It's not possible for you to do. So what you need to do is you need to convince everyone around them that this is the right thing. And we've actually gotten to a point where we had one particular group that really was kind of more towards the laggard side of this process and the new modern ways of working. And they kind of fought back against some of the mission and the vision that we had. And they fought back against it for a long time, but we've recently convinced their people way above them that this is important. And because we've convinced the people way above them that this is important, it doesn't matter that they're laggards. They now get pulled along with the rest of the adoption curve because we've been able to convince someone from the early adopters, early majority kind of section who has power to actually affect change to change. They will happen. They are frustrating as hell. It's I have lost sleep trying to deal with laggards and negative change agents, but don't try as much as you can not to let them get to you, and instead work on affecting change of people around them, pulling people around them. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, one other thing, if we more go, let's say you actively change a technology or a tool you're using. What will happen during a specific time, you will support, let's say, the old tool and the new tool while everybody's moving. And in the end, what you like to do is to make sure that the old tool is completely gone. Or you will have tech debt in terms of okay, now I have that old tool. Do you actively have a process, a cleanup process at the end to make sure that everything has moved in order to prevent that tech debt? Or is it something that you say, well, it's part of changing?
So the question is, make sure that I phrase this correctly, applying these concepts to technical changes, and how do we prevent things like technical debt when applying these concepts to technical changes? Is that more or less right? Okay, cool. So most change initiatives, when you want something to change, it's about people. It's not about tools or technology. So when you're talking about how do we go from one set of physical tooling to another set of physical tooling, you need to go through these same steps, go through this same process, but you're going through this process not for the tool, but for the people who use the tool. And because it's about the people and not the actual tool, you wind up having the same type of diffusion curve. You wind up having people who are laggards, adopters who are laggards, not necessarily systems that are. So in terms of resolving technical debt is a matter of convincing all of the individuals involved in that social structure that it's important to have a full paradigm shift, not a partial paradigm shift. So if you still have some of tool X in your system and you want to move everything to tool Y, I would want you to examine why that still exists. What are the social and community barriers for that still existing? Is it because you're working on a tight budget and you can't prioritize technical debt? If that's the case, you need to kind of dissect that. The 5 whys to kind of get to the root cause is a good way to work through that. But figure out what the social constructs are that are preventing you from actually finishing off that technical debt, finishing off that migration. And I believe once you get there, you'll find that the individuals you're dealing with wind up closer to the late majority and laggard part of the diffusion curve. And if you can convince them, then technical debt prioritization becomes a lot easier because there's no longer a conversation of why do we need to prioritize this. But the focus is, or the key point is, focus your change initiatives on the people, not the underlying technology. Yeah? Cool. I think that's it. Thank you all very much. I am Snugug on all of the internets, and see you around.